She didn't come to Seoul to fall in love with a monster. She came to build something that mattered, but the city had other plans, and so did the man who controlled it from the shadows. Zuri Bennett once had everything: a thriving architectural firm, a name people respected, a future she carved out with her own two hands in a country that wasn't her own. Then in the span of 7 days, someone she trusted burned it all down. Now, a man in a wheelchair, the most feared criminal in South Korea, is offering her a way back. The catch? She has to marry him. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling for 4 days straight, not the soft, forgiving kind that washed streets clean and left the air smelling like wet earth. This was Seoul rain in November. Cold and relentless, the kind that got inside your collar and stayed there, the kind that turned the Han River the color of old concrete and made every streetlight blur into a smear of sick yellow. Zuri Bennett stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of what used to be her office on the 14th floor of the Mapo-gu building and watched the city drown and thought about how fitting it was. 2 years. 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days since she'd first signed the lease on this space. She remembered that morning with the kind of clarity that only came when something was gone. She'd brought cheap champagne in a paper bag. The good stuff was for after the first major contract, she'd told herself. And she'd stood in this exact spot and looked out at the Seoul skyline and felt something she hadn't felt since she was 22 years old and fresh out of architecture school in Atlanta with borrowed money and borrowed confidence. She'd felt like she was going to make it. Now the champagne was a memory, and the office was getting packed into cardboard boxes by 2 men she'd never met before, both of them hired by the attorneys representing Park Sung-hoon, her former business partner, her former friend, the man who had spent the last 6 months quietly, methodically, and thoroughly destroying her. One of the movers bumped a stack of rolled blueprints off the drafting table. They hit the floor and scattered. He didn't apologize. Zuri didn't say anything. She didn't trust her voice right now. She hadn't trusted it since Tuesday, when the second lawsuit landed on her desk. A fabricated breach of contract claim from a contractor she'd never personally hired, a contractor she now understood had been on Park Sung-hoon's payroll for months before he ever stepped foot in a Bennett architecture project. The whole thing had been engineered. Every piece, every document, every email chain, every strategically misrouted payment, all of it constructed to make her look like a fraud in her own company. She wasn't a fraud. She was just someone who had trusted the wrong man. Her phone buzzed on the windowsill. She looked at the screen. Her attorney, Ji Young, for the 3rd time this afternoon. She let it ring. The things Ji Young had to say were things Zuri already knew. The civil suits were going to cost more than the firm's remaining assets. The Korean business registration for Bennett Architecture had been flagged by 2 separate government agencies thanks to backdated paperwork submitted by Park's attorneys. Her visa status, which had been tied to the company's operation license, was now in question, and the bridge loan she'd taken out 18 months ago to fund the Incheon waterfront project, the project that was supposed to be her masterpiece, the one that was going to make her name permanent in this city. That loan had been co-signed by a shell company that Park had quietly dissolved last month. She owed 480 million Korean won to a private lender who had already sent 2 very large, very quiet men to stand in her building lobby for 3 hours on Monday morning. The rain hit the glass in sheets. Zuri pressed her forehead against the window and let the cold transfer through. It helped, slightly. It was something real in a week that had felt completely unreal. She was 34 years old. She had come to Seoul 6 years ago with a portfolio, a proficiency in Korean she'd spent 3 years building, and a specific, stubborn certainty that she was going to do something that mattered. She had grown up watching her mother work 2 jobs to keep the lights on in their apartment in Charlotte, and she had sworn, not to anyone out loud, just to the hard, certain place inside herself, that she was going to build things. Not just buildings, legacies, structures that would still be standing long after she was gone. And she had. For a while, she genuinely had. Bennett Architecture had landed 3 significant contracts in its first 18 months. A cultural center in Seodamun, a residential tower concept in Gangnam that had been featured in 2 international design magazines, a community arts space in Mapo that she'd personally overseen from foundation to ribbon cutting, and that still, on her worst days, made her chest ache with something that felt like genuine pride. Park Sung-hoon had come into the picture 20 months ago, introduced through a mutual contact in the Seoul architecture community. He was smooth, connected, fluent in 4 languages, and charming in the particular way of men who had learned early in life that charm was a tool. He'd brought capital. He'd brought contacts. He'd suggested the merger of their firms with the kind of easy confidence that made it seem like the obvious next step. And Zuri, who was good at buildings and less good at detecting the long game of a man who had already decided what he was going to take from her, had agreed. She'd signed the partnership agreement without reading the fine print about dissolution rights. That was the original sin. Everything else had been consequence. The mover picked up the scattered blueprints without looking at her and shoved them into a box without bothering to re-roll them properly. Zuri watched the corners crumple. "Careful," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. The mover glanced at her with the blank expression of a man who had been told she had no authority here anymore and went back to what he was doing. Zuri turned away from the window. She picked up the one box she had packed herself, a small one, just the thing she couldn't leave behind. A framed photo of her mother standing in front of the Seodamun Cultural Center on opening day, both of them squinting into the autumn sun. A small model of the Incheon waterfront proposal she'd built by hand 3 years ago, when the project was still just a dream and the world still made sense. A worn copy of a structural engineering text she'd had since graduate school, its spine cracked and its margins full of notes in 2 languages. She walked out of the office without looking back. The elevator was slow, and the lobby smelled like wet umbrellas. Outside, the rain hit her immediately, and she stood on the pavement for a moment, box under one arm, and let it soak through her jacket. A taxi splashed through a puddle 6 feet away, and the cold water hit her ankles, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "I have nowhere to go." Not nowhere as in no physical location. She had a rented apartment in Mapo, though the lease was up in 3 weeks, and she wasn't sure anymore how she was going to cover it. Nowhere as in no plan. No trajectory. No version of tomorrow that didn't start with more debt and more lawyers and more of the specific grinding humiliation of watching something you built get disassembled by someone else's hands. She started walking. She walked for 40 minutes in the rain before she realized she had no specific destination and turned into a convenience store just to get out of the weather. She bought a coffee from the machine near the door and stood dripping next to the magazine rack and stared at nothing while the fluorescent lights hummed above her, and a teenage kid at the counter watched a video on his phone with the sound turned up. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Ji Young. The number on the screen had a Seoul prefix she didn't recognize. Not a contact in her phone. Not a number she'd seen before. She almost let it go to voicemail. She'd been doing that a lot lately, avoiding calls from numbers she didn't recognize, because in the last 2 weeks, most of those calls had been from people wanting things from her she didn't have. She answered it anyway. "Miss Bennett." The voice on the other end was male, Korean, professionally neutral in the way that said the speaker had been trained to sound that way. "My name is Shin. I'm calling on behalf of a private client. He would like to meet with you, tonight, if possible." Zuri stared at the coffee in her hand. "Who's your client?" A brief pause. "His name is Kang Ji Tai." She knew the name. Everyone in Seoul knew the name, or at least everyone who had been here long enough to learn which names you said carefully and which ones you didn't say at all. Kang Ji Tai was the kind of name that came up in hushed conversations at industry events, in careful asides from Korean colleagues who knew she was navigating a world she hadn't grown up in. He was the head of what the press occasionally, obliquely, referred to as the Kang Organization, a sprawling network of businesses, real estate holdings, and less visible operations that stretched across Seoul, Busan, and reportedly several other things people chose not to examine too closely. He had survived a car bombing 3 years ago. He was, by every account she'd ever heard, completely untouchable. And he was calling her. "Why," she said flatly, "does Kang Ji Tai want to meet with me?" "He'll explain that himself, Miss Bennett." Another pause. This one deliberately measured. "He's aware of your current situation. He believes he can help." She almost laughed. The sound stayed in her chest instead. "Everyone who says they can help me lately wants something in return." "Yes," the voice said, without any particular inflection. "He does." At least it was honest. She looked at the rain outside the convenience store window. She thought about the 480 million won and the crumpled blueprints and the men charot in her lobby on Monday and the particular way Park Sung-hoon had smiled at her during their last meeting, right before he'd had his attorney hand her the first lawsuit. That smile. The private satisfaction of someone who had planned everything and executed it perfectly. "Where?" she said. The car that arrived for her 20 minutes later was black, immaculate, and driven by a man who was approximately the size of a refrigerator and who spoke exactly 4 words to her during the entire 40-minute drive. "Seatbelt, please." "Thank you." She watched Seoul slide past the rain-blurred windows as they climbed out of Mapo and into the hills north of the city, the buildings thinning and the road narrowing and the lights below becoming a distant, glittering geometry. The estate appeared at the end of a private road behind 2 sets of gates that opened without visible effort. Even in the rain and the dark, it was clearly substantial, long and low and surrounded by carefully maintained landscape that managed to look both deliberate and severe, like something designed to convey that whoever lived here had power over the natural world as well as the human one. Inside the main entrance, she was met by a woman named Kim, who was approximately 60 and carried herself like a retired general. Kim took Zuri's wet jacket with an expression that neither judged nor pitied, and led her through a corridor that was wide and spare, and hung with art that was good enough to be institutional. The whole house was quiet in a way that felt active rather than empty. The specific quiet of a place where noise had been deliberately eliminated. They stopped at a set of double doors. Kim knocked once, opened one door, and stepped back. Zuri went in. The room was a study, large, high-ceilinged, lined on 2 walls with bookshelves that were actually used rather than decorated, because the books were in no particular order and several of them had pages turned down. A desk sat at the far end, heavy and unornamented, covered in documents that had been organized in the systematic way of someone who thought in structured information. Floor lamps, no overhead lighting, a window that faced the city below, the rain still coming down, Seoul still burning in the dark. Kang Ji-tae sat behind the desk in a high-backed wheelchair. She had heard about the wheelchair. She'd been told, in the way of secondhand information passed through careful channels, that the car bombing 3 years ago had left him with significant spinal injuries. What she hadn't been told, or maybe hadn't fully processed until this moment, was that the wheelchair did nothing to diminish the weight of his presence. He was in his mid-40s, dark hair, cut close, a face that had been roughly made to begin with and had been further reorganized by whatever happened 3 years ago, a slight asymmetry to his jaw, a scar that ran from his left cheekbone toward his ear, mostly but not entirely concealed. He wore a dark shirt, no tie, and had the kind of stillness about him that wasn't calm so much as control. The stillness of a man who had decided a long time ago that showing anything he didn't choose to show was a form of weakness. His eyes tracked her from the moment she stepped through the door, and they didn't let go. "Miss Bennett," he said. His English was precise and accented and completely assured. "Sit down." Not please, not a question, just a statement of what was going to happen. Zuri sat in the chair across from his desk because she'd walked 40 minutes in the rain and ridden 40 minutes in a car, and she was wet and tired, and the chair was there. "You know who I am," he said. "Yes." "Then you know I don't make phone calls like this without purpose." "I figured." He reached across the desk and pushed a single document toward her. It was printed, not handwritten, approximately 8 pages long, and the top line read, "Contract of Arrangement, Provisional Terms." She looked at it without touching it. "What is this?" "A proposal," Ji-tae said. "Read it before you react." "Give me the version that fits in 2 sentences." Something crossed his face, not quite surprise, not quite anything else she could name. He looked at her steadily for a moment, reassessing, and then said, "You agree to marry me. 18 months. A legal public marriage with all appropriate appearances and conduct maintained. In exchange, I eliminate your current debts, restore your company's registration and operational licenses, and provide a capital injection sufficient to restart Bennett architecture at a scale significantly beyond what you had before." The rain outside, the quiet of the room, her own heartbeat, which she could feel in her throat. "You want to marry me?" she said. "Contractually." "Yes." "Why?" Ji-tae leaned back slightly in his chair. His hands, which had been resting flat on the desk, moved to the armrests with the controlled deliberateness of a man who thought about every physical thing he did. I have rivals who interpret my current situation as an opportunity. An unmarried man, a man perceived as isolated, is a man they believe can be pressured, destabilized, removed. A man with a committed partnership presents a different kind of stability. Specifically, a partnership with a foreign national with a legitimate professional reputation presents a particular kind of signal that my enemies will find very difficult to interpret as weakness. So I'm a strategy. You're a solution, he said, as I am one for you. She looked at the contract. She thought about Ji Young's last voicemail, which she still hadn't listened to, but which she already knew contained nothing good. She thought about the men in her lobby. She thought about the crumpled blueprints and the smiling face of Park Sung-hoon. Separate lives, she said, within the arrangement. Separate wings of the estate. No requirements beyond public appearances and the maintenance of a credible shared residence. Your professional life remains entirely your own. My firm is genuinely mine, not a shell, not something you can pull out from under me. Read the contract, he said. Section 4, paragraph 2. Ownership structure. She hadn't touched it yet. She looked at him instead. What happens if I say no? It wasn't a real question. They both knew it wasn't, but she needed to ask it. Jitae looked at her with the expression of a man who had already calculated the answer before she walked in the door. Your debt to the Shino Private Lending Group becomes due in full in 9 days. They have already engaged a collection firm. Your visa will flag within 30 days of your company losing its license, which will happen by the end of the month. He paused. You return to Atlanta with nothing, or you stay and build something. With you, adjacent to me, he had said. There's a difference. Zuri stared at him. She was 34 years old, and she had built a firm from nothing, and she had trusted the wrong man, and she had walked 40 minutes in the rain, and she was sitting in a room with the most feared criminal in South Korea, and he was offering her a way back, and it cost her name. It cost her name and 18 months and whatever she thought she'd imagined her future looking like. She pulled the contract across the desk. She started reading. The terms were thorough, and they were not cruel. She'd been half expecting them to be cruel. Some part of her had walked into this room braced for something predatory. An exit clause that would leave her worse off than when she'd started. A condition buried in subsection language that would give him leverage over her she didn't see coming. She read the contract twice, slowly, and what she found instead was precision. Section 1 covered the public terms of the arrangement. Legal marriage registration, a minimum of joint public appearances to be determined by a schedule they would agree on in advance, shared residence at the Kang estate outside Seoul, conduct consistent with a credible marital partnership. No specifics about what that conduct entailed beyond professional public presentation. Section 2 covered her debt. Every line. The Shino Lending Group liability would be settled within 72 hours of her signature. The outstanding contractor claims and fabricated breach of contract lawsuits would be addressed through Jitai's legal team, who would, the contract noted without elaboration, pursue available remedies. She'd been around enough of Seoul's professional world to know what that meant. Section 3 covered Bennett architecture. Restoration of business registration and operating licenses within 7 days. A capital injection of 2 billion won, more than 4 times what her firm had operated on at its best. Structured as an interest-free operational loan with no repayment schedule during the term of the contract. Ownership, 100% hers, no equity, no management rights, no conditions on her professional decisions. Section 4 made that explicit with language so unambiguous, it read like someone had anticipated exactly the question she was going to ask and answered it in advance. Section 5 covered the termination terms. At the end of 18 months, both parties would have the option to extend by mutual agreement or to dissolve the arrangement. In the event of dissolution, Zuri retained all professional assets and reputation restoration accomplished during the term. The capital injection would convert to a standard commercial loan at market rate with an 18-month grace period before repayment began. It was, she thought, reading it for the 3rd time, almost fair. More than almost. She set the document down. Jitai had not moved or spoken while she read. He was watching her with the same controlled attention he'd had since she walked in. and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he had spent the time cataloging things about her she wasn't consciously showing. "Who wrote this?" she said. "My attorney, under my direction. The terms in Section 3, the ownership language. That's—" She stopped, chose her words. "That's more protective than it needs to be." "I want a functional architect," Jitai said, "not a resentful prisoner. Agreements that leave one party with nothing to lose are agreements that fail." She studied his face, the scar along his jaw, the way his hands rested on the armrests with that particular deliberateness. "You've done this before." "No," he said, "but I've made enough bad agreements to know what the wrong structure looks like." Silence. "I need 24 hours, she said. "No?" She looked at him. "Excuse me. The Shino collection firm has been given a timeline. 48 hours from this moment, their next step becomes significantly more disruptive. If you need to verify the contract terms, my attorney can be reached tonight. If you have professional counsel you want to review it, I can provide 48 hours. But you don't have 24 hours to think about it, and then 48 hours to have it reviewed. You have 48 hours total." He looked at her with no inflection. "You can also simply read it again and decide tonight. The document is clear. You're very used to people doing what you say." "I'm very used to being right about what needs to happen," he said. "There's a difference." She almost said something sharp. She pulled it back. She read the document again. She signed it at 11:47 p.m. while the rain still hammered the windows and the city burned below the hills, and Kang Ji-tai watched her with those steady, unreadable eyes, and the only sound in the room was the scratch of the pen and her own breathing. Kim showed her to a guest room in the east wing that was larger than her entire apartment in Mappo and smelled like clean linen and cedar. There was a bathroom with heated floors and a wardrobe that had been stocked. She discovered this with a feeling she couldn't immediately name, with clothes in her size. She stood in the center of the room for a long time. She thought about calling Ji young. She thought about calling her mother in Charlotte, who was going to have feelings about this that Zuri didn't have the emotional bandwidth to manage right now. She thought about Park Sung-hoon sleeping peacefully somewhere in this city, satisfied with what he'd built and destroyed, completely unaware that the woman he'd dismantled had just signed her way into the orbit of the one man in Seoul, capable of making his comfortable future very uncomfortable. She didn't call anyone. She lay down on the bed in her still damp clothes and stared at the ceiling and thought about the contract. 18 months. She could do 18 months. She had done harder things for less. She fell asleep with the rain still coming down and woke in the gray pre-dawn quiet to the sound of the house beginning to move around her. Distant footsteps, the low sound of a door somewhere, the particular acoustic signature of a large building occupied by people who moved with discipline and purpose. She lay still for a moment, assembling herself. Then she got up, found the bathroom, found a change of clothes that fit correctly in the wardrobe, and tried to understand what her life was now. Breakfast was brought to her room. She ate alone and looked at the estate in daylight for the first time, which revealed it to be both larger and more interesting than she'd understood in the rain and the dark. The architect's part of her brain, which never fully turned off, took inventory automatically. The building was contemporary, but not aggressively so. Stone and steel and glass used with restraint, the kind of restraint that indicated either exceptional taste or an exceptional architect behind the original design. The landscape was formal in its structure, but harsh in its planting. Native Korean species, wind-shaped, growing into and around the architecture rather than being disciplined by it. It was, she thought grudgingly, beautiful in a severe sort of way. It was also, she thought less grudgingly, cold. Not in temperature. In quality. The way institutional spaces were cold. Efficient rather than inhabited. Like a building that had been designed and built and then never quite loved into being a home. She was still cataloging it through the guest room window when a knock came at the door. It was Shin, the same voice from the phone call, attached to a man who was approximately 40 and wore the kind of suit that was designed to not be noticed. He told her that Mr. Kang would see her in the main study when she was ready and that there were no standing time requirements, but that there were practical matters related to the arrangement that needed to be discussed before the end of the morning. She went. Jitae was already working when she arrived. Not performing work for her benefit, actually working, the desk covered in documents he was moving through with the focused efficiency of someone who had been at it for hours. He finished the paragraph he was reading before he looked up, and even then the look was the abrupt return to attention of a man pulling himself away from something important rather than a courtesy. "Coffee," he said. Not offering, observing. There was a second cup on the desk. She sat. She took the coffee. It was black and correct. "The press announcement will go out Friday," he said. "We'll describe the marriage as private and recent. The story that will circulate among people who matter is that we met through a professional introduction related to architectural development, and that the relationship moved quickly. You'll be introduced at an industry event in 3 weeks that I had already committed to attending. Questions will be deflected to a standard statement from my communications team." "What does the statement say?" He slid a single page across the desk. She read it. It was brief and carefully constructed, warm enough to be credible, opaque enough to be uninformative. "Fine," she said. "What about Bennett Architecture? You said 7 days for the license restoration." "My attorney contacted the relevant agency this morning. There's an administrative hearing Thursday. It should conclude by end of day." A pause. "Should. And the lawsuits being addressed." She looked at him. "That's a very broad thing to say." "Park Sung-hoon has certain interests that are currently being examined closely," Ji-tae said, without any particular change in his expression. "His legal team will be significantly occupied in the near future. The claims against you will be withdrawn." Zuri set her coffee down. "I want to be clear about something." "Go ahead." "Whatever happens to Park Sung-hoon, I need to not know about it." He looked at her steadily. "That can be arranged." "I'm not asking because I care what happens to him," she said. "I'm asking because I need to be able to function professionally in this city for the rest of my life, and there are things it's better not to be able to testify about." "You've thought about this carefully." "I've had about 8 hours," she said. "But yes." Something in his face shifted, barely, just at the edges. Not warmth exactly, more like recalibration. Like she'd said something that slightly altered the calculations he'd been running since she walked in. "Your professional conduct is your own," he said. "What happens in the operation of this house and this organization is mine. Those will not intersect." "Good." They looked at each other across the desk. "You'll need to move in fully by Saturday," he said. "Not because of the arrangement, because of the security situation. Having you in Mappo without a protection detail is... I don't need a protection detail." "You didn't," he said, "before Friday. That changes when the press release goes out." Zuri opened her mouth and then didn't say what she'd been about to say because she recognized that he was right, and she hated it. Being seen as the wife of Kang Ji-tae, even contractually, even in fiction, was going to change the way the world looked at her and the way certain parts of the world thought about what they could do to her. "Fine," she said. "I'll need a workspace. There's a studio in the north wing that hasn't been used. Drafting tables, good light. You can modify it as needed. I'll need my own access to it, not clearance dependent. Your biometrics will be registered to all non-restricted areas of the estate by tomorrow morning." She nodded. They both drank their coffee. The silence between them was uncomfortable in a way that was specific. Not hostile, not warm, something in between. The silence of two people who had agreed to share a geography and hadn't yet understood the texture of what that meant. "I need you to understand something," Ji-tae said. She waited. "This arrangement is what it says it is, nothing more. Nothing is expected from you beyond what is written in the contract. I'm telling you this not as reassurance, but as a statement of operating parameters." She met his eyes, the scar along his jaw, the controlled, deliberate stillness of him. "I know what I signed." People sometimes think they know, and then behave as though they expected something different. "I'm not people," she said. That look again, that small, barely perceptible recalibration. "No," he said after a moment. "I don't think you are." She moved in on Saturday. The move took less time than she expected because she had less than she'd realized. 2 suitcases and 4 boxes, the detritus of a life that had been compressed by a bad week. She stood in the entrance of the estate's east wing bedroom that was now, technically, her bedroom, and looked at her 4 boxes stacked against a wall that was larger than most rooms she'd lived in, and felt the specific smallness of her current life with a clarity that was almost funny. The room had been prepared with the same thoroughness as the guest room. Everything anticipated, nothing missing, the kind of hospitality that expressed itself through efficiency rather than warmth. There were fresh flowers on the dresser. They were white and architectural and clearly chosen by someone who thought about aesthetics rather than feeling. She unpacked slowly. She put her mother's photo on the windowsill. She put the Incheon model on the desk. She put her graduate school textbook on the nightstand. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at these three things and thought, "You have to be careful, Zuri. You have to be very careful what you let yourself feel about the situation you've put yourself in." Because it was already not quite what she'd expected. Kang Ji-tae was not what she'd expected. She'd expected cruelty or contempt or some version of the easy arrogance of powerful men who'd never been told no. What she'd found instead was something more difficult to categorize. He was cold, yes. He was controlled in a way that felt less like personality and more like armor. He asked nothing of her that wasn't in the contract, and he was scrupulously, impersonally fair. But there were things, small things. The clothes in her size in the guest room the night she arrived. The second coffee cup on the desk the next morning. The studio in the north wing he'd mentioned with a specificity, drafting tables, good light, that meant someone had thought about what she actually needed. She didn't know what to do with those things yet. She put them in a category she labeled, "Do not examine this." Mom. She met his core staff on Sunday. Shin, who she'd already spoken to, was Jitae's head of security. Meticulous, unexpressive, one of those people who made you feel watched even when his eyes were pointed somewhere else. Kim was the estate manager and had clearly run the place with military precision for longer than Zuri had been in Korea. There were two housekeeping staff she was introduced to, and whose names she immediately committed to memory because she'd been raised by a woman who believed that was basic courtesy, and a driver named Park Dae-jung, who asked her in excellent English if she had any preferences for driving music, and then, when she said she didn't, played something Korean and classical that turned out to be exactly right. Jitae himself she saw for approximately 45 minutes Sunday, a brief working lunch where he explained the upcoming schedule and confirmed the Friday press release and gave her a communication protocol that she was to use if she needed to reach him directly. It was efficient and impersonal, and she appreciated both things. After he left, she went to the North Wing studio and stood in the space for a long time. It was good. She hadn't expected it to be good. High ceilings, north-facing skylights that gave clean, non-directional light, space for multiple drafting tables, walls that could take pinboards. Whoever had designed this house, and she was increasingly curious about who that was, had understood that a workspace for detailed visual work needed light that didn't impose itself. She stood in the middle of the room and felt something she hadn't felt in nearly 2 weeks, something that resembled the beginning of readiness. She was going to be okay. She was going to rebuild. She was going to get through this arrangement intact and professional, and on the other side, she was going to have a company that no one could take away from her again because she was going to build it this time without trusting anyone she couldn't afford to lose. She believed this. She stood in the good north light, and she believed it absolutely. She was still standing there when Kim appeared in the doorway. "Miss Bennett," Kim said, in the careful English she used when she wanted to be precisely understood. "Mr. Kang asks that you join him in the main room this evening. There is something he needs to tell you." Zuri turned. Kim's expression was professionally composed, but her eyes were doing something that in another person's face would have been worry. "What is it?" Zuri said. "He will explain," Kim said. "But, Miss Bennett, the press release went out early." Zuri felt something drop in her chest. "It was supposed to go Friday." "Yes," Kim said. "Someone in Mr. Kang's communications network provided the information to a media contact in advance." The floor of Zuri's stomach went cold. "Provided. Or sold." Kim said nothing. "Kim," Zuri said carefully, "is there a leak in this house?" Kim looked at her with those steady, worried eyes. "Mr. Kang," she said, "is waiting." And somewhere below the hill, in the glittering, sprawling dark of Seoul, Zuri's name was already running across every major newsfeed in the country. Attached to a man whose enemies had just been handed information they were not supposed to have yet, and who were already, at that exact moment, deciding what to do about the woman who had just made herself the most interesting target Kang Ji-tae had ever given them. The main room was not where she expected to find him. She'd been in the study twice now and had begun to think of it as his room, the place where he operated, where the desk and the documents and the controlled geometry of his working life lived. But Kim led her past the study, past the dining room, to a space she hadn't been in yet. A long, low-ceilinged room at the back of the house that faced the city through a wall of glass and was furnished with the kind of severe minimalism that stopped just short of being comfortable. Ji-tae was at the window. He had his back to her when she entered, and he didn't turn immediately. He was looking at Seoul burning in the dark below the hill, and she could see the tension in his shoulders from across the room, the set of a man who is holding something in rather than letting it show. Shin was in the room too, standing near the door, and his expression had moved from its usual blankness into something tighter. "Close the door," Ji-tae said, still without turning. Kim closed it from the outside. Zuri walked to the center of the room and stopped. She wasn't going to stand near the wall like she'd been summoned. "Talk," she said. Ji-tae turned. His face had the specific quality of controlled anger, not hot, not explosive, the kind that ran cold and deep and was more dangerous for it. His jaw was set. His eyes moved to her face and stayed there. The press release was provided to Oh Sung-jun at the Seoul Economic Daily 14 hours before our scheduled Friday release, he said. Oh Sung-jun published it 40 minutes ago. It is currently on 17 news aggregators and has been picked up by 2 international wire services. "I know what a leak means," Zuri said. "I'm asking who." Ji-tae looked at Shin. Shin said, "We have 3 people with access to the release draft. We're working through it." 3 people, Zuri said. "In this house. In the communications chain. Not all of them are based here." She looked back at Ji-tae. "What does this mean, practically? For me?" "It means your name is in the public sphere 12 hours earlier than we controlled for," Ji-tae said. "It means the people I wanted to hear this information from a managed source heard it from a news feed instead. The difference between those 2 things is the difference between a narrative I control and a narrative that's currently being written by people I haven't spoken to." "And who are those people?" Silence. Ji-tae. She'd used his name for the first time. It came out sharper than she intended. "You asked me to trust a contract. I signed it. I moved my life into your house. If there are people who are going to look at that announcement and decide to do something about it, I need to know who they are." Ji-tae looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that was measuring something. Then he moved to a chair and sat, and the movement had the quality of a decision, not just about sitting, but about what he was going to say. "There are 4 active competing organizations in Seoul that have been monitoring my operational stability since the incident 3 years ago," he said. "Of those 4, 2 are primarily interested in territory. 1 is interested in specific business holdings. The 4th..." He stopped. Something crossed his face. "The 4th is interested in me, personally, in what can be used against me personally. And now they know you have a wife. Now they know I have a wife they didn't know about until 40 minutes ago," he said, "which means they're currently asking what else they don't know about." Zuri sat down in the chair across from him because her legs were tired and her chest was doing something uncomfortable, and she needed to be level with him for this conversation. "You're telling me that whoever leaked the release may have done it specifically to destabilize your position. I'm telling you it's possible. Or someone in your organization just sold a story to a journalist for some quick money. Also possible. Those 2 possibilities have very different implications for what happens next." "Yes," he said. He looked at her steadily. "They do." She held his gaze. The scar along his jaw looked sharper in this light. He was tired. She could see it now that she was looking for it. The specific tiredness of someone who had been managing a crisis since before she woke up this morning and was refusing to let it show in any way that mattered. "What do you need from me?" she said. Something shifted in his expression. It was quick and he controlled it immediately, but she caught it. A flicker of something that might have been surprise. "Nothing tonight," he said. "Tomorrow Shin will review the security protocols with you. You'll have a detail assigned when you leave the estate. You won't be driving yourself anywhere for the foreseeable future." "I already agreed to that." "I know. I'm confirming the timeline moved up." She nodded. She looked at Shin, who was still standing near the door with his tight expression. "Have you eaten anything?" she said to Jitai. He blinked. It was the most unguarded physical response she'd seen from him. "What?" "It's 9:30. Kim brought me dinner at 7. I'm asking if you've eaten." A beat of silence. "That's not relevant," he said. "It's extremely relevant if you're going to spend the next 6 hours managing a crisis," she said. "I'll tell Kim." She stood up. She walked to the door. She was aware of his eyes on her back, carrying that same quality of recalibration she'd noticed before. She didn't examine it. She found Kim in the corridor. 3 days passed in the specific suspended quality of a situation that was building toward something you couldn't see yet. The news cycle, as Jitae's communications team had predicted, was intense and then brief. Kang Jitae and his unexpected American wife were a story for roughly 48 hours, long enough for 2 major Korean entertainment news sites to post pieces with stock photos of the Kang estate and very little actual information, long enough for 3 different Seoul Society commentators to post analysis about what this meant for the Kang organization's trajectory. Not quite long enough for anyone to dig up anything they weren't supposed to have. Zuri gave no comment. She had been instructed not to, and she wouldn't have anyway. She spent those 3 days in the North Wing studio where Jitae's attorney had confirmed that Bennett Architecture's operating license had been restored as of Thursday morning. She had a company again. She had nothing in it yet. No staff, no active contracts, the capital injection not yet transferred while the paperwork finalized. But she had the legal structure, the name, the history of work that hadn't been erased regardless of what Park Sung-hoon had tried. She sat at one of the drafting tables in the good north light and started rebuilding. Not a business plan, not a strategy document. She started the way she always started, the way she'd started when she was 22 years old with borrowed money and borrowed confidence. She started drawing the Incheon waterfront concept. Her own, the real one. Not the compromised version Park had steered her toward in the final months. She pulled it back up from memory and from the small model on her desk, and she started putting it back on paper, line by line, the way you excavated something buried. She was 3 hours into it the first time Jitae came to the studio. She heard the quiet sound of his wheelchair in the corridor before the knock, the specific acoustic signature of it that she was already learning, the soft mechanical precision, and said, "Come in," without looking up from the table. He came in. He stopped near the door. She kept drawing for a moment. Then she set down her pen and turned. He was looking at the work on the drafting table. Not at her, at the work. And his expression, for just a moment, was undefended in a way she hadn't seen before. Something about the drawings had pulled his attention before he could decide whether to let it. "The Incheon waterfront concept," she said. "I know what it is," he said. "I've seen the original proposal." She stared at him. "You've seen my work. I reviewed your professional history before I called you." "Of course you did." She turned back to the table. "What do you need?" "Nothing," he said. "I was checking the studio was functional." "It is. Thank you for it." He didn't leave. She could feel him still there, still looking at the drawings. After a moment, he moved further into the room, and she was aware of him the way you were aware of something that displaced a lot of air, even when it moved quietly. "The east-facing cantilever on the main platform," he said, "on the original proposal. You changed the overhang calculation from the concept to the presentation model." She looked at him. "You read it closely enough to notice that." "I read things closely." "The original calculation was more structurally ambitious," she said. "Park thought it was too aggressive for a first major commission. I compromised." She paused. "I shouldn't have." Jitae looked at the drawing. "Put it back." "I intend to." Another silence. A different quality to it than the ones before. Less like 2 people holding their positions, and more like 2 people briefly inhabiting the same space without fighting it. "The leak has been identified," he said. She turned fully. "Who?" "A contract communications assistant who had been placed in my network by outside interests approximately 8 months ago." His voice was completely level. "He has been dealt with." "Dealt with," she repeated. "He is no longer a problem and he is unharmed," Jitae said. "I want to be precise about that because I don't want you building a narrative about this organization that isn't accurate." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you for telling me." "You needed to know." Which organization placed him? A pause. The one that's interested in me personally. The fourth one. Yes, she thought about that. About what it meant that someone had been in his network for 8 months, feeding information, and hadn't been identified until now. About what that said about the scope of what Jitai was managing and the depth of attention his enemies were paying. How long has this been going on? She said. This particular campaign. He looked at her carefully, like he was deciding how much of the answer to give. Since the bombing, he said finally. 3 years. 3 years of someone trying to destabilize me, yes. He said it without self-pity and without performance. Just a fact. The wheelchair was supposed to finish it. When it didn't, they moved to other methods. Zuri looked at him. She looked at the scar and the wheelchair and the controlled, armored stillness of him and thought about what 3 years of sustained, coordinated assault on your position looked like from the inside. What it did to a person. What it required. She didn't say any of that. Then we'd better make this look convincing, she said. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. We'd better. But the first public appearance was at an architectural development forum in Gangnam, 2 weeks after the press release. It had been selected deliberately, a professional event rather than a social one, territory where Zuri had standing and legitimacy, where the narrative of how they'd met would be organic and verifiable. Jitae's team had briefed her extensively on the expected attendees, the relevant power relationships, the people who were watching, and what they were watching for. She stood in the bedroom mirror at 6:15 in the evening and looked at the woman in the dark green dress and told her to hold it together. She'd been dressed for important things before. She'd stood at the front of rooms and presented proposals and negotiated contracts and done all the things that required the version of herself that didn't flinch. But this was different, and she was aware of that with a clarity she wasn't going to share with anyone. This was performing a marriage to a man she'd known for less than 3 weeks, in a room full of people who knew him, some of whom were almost certainly watching for cracks. She put on her earrings, the simple gold ones her mother had given her, and went downstairs. Jitae was in the entrance hall. He was in a dark suit, precisely cut, and the wheelchair somehow disappeared when you actually looked at him. Not because it wasn't there, not because she stopped seeing it, but because the force of his presence simply took up all the available attention. He was looking at his phone when she came down the stairs, and when he looked up and saw her, the phone stopped being what he was thinking about. He didn't say anything for a moment. You look... He stopped, chose a different formulation. You're ready? I've been ready for 20 minutes, she said. Something twitched at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the ghost of one. Then let's go. The room knew who he was the moment he entered it. She felt it, the particular atmospheric shift of a space, recognizing a power it could not entirely account for. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they adjusted. Postures changed, the specific social alertness of people who were successful enough to know which arrivals mattered moved through the room like a current. And then people looked at her. She kept her chin up. She kept her shoulder near his, near enough to read as partnership without being performative about it. She smiled at the right moments and spoke Korean with the fluency she'd built over 6 years, and shook hands with people whose names she'd memorized from the briefing and watched the room recalibrate its understanding of Kang Ji-tae in real time. He was different here than he was at home. Not more human, exactly, but more present in the way of someone who was very good at existing in a room and knew it. He introduced her simply, always by name, never by explanation, in a way that said she didn't require explanation. He let her take conversational leads when they were in her territory and took them back when they were in his, and the handoff between them was, she thought, probably more natural than it had any right to be. They were an hour in when she felt the first specific wrongness. A man across the room, not looking at Jitai, looking at her. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed, with the kind of soft, expensive face that had never needed to be hard because other people had always been hard on his behalf. He was with a group she'd been briefed on, associates of the CO family, one of the 4 competing organizations. He looked at her the way someone looked at a calculation they were running. She didn't react. She turned slightly so Jitae was in her line of sight and said quietly, "The man in the gray suit near the East Bar. He's been watching me for 10 minutes. Jitai didn't look. Seo Mingyu's father's associate, Nam Tae-sik. A pause. He's not watching you. He's watching what I do about the fact that he's watching you. That's a distinction that doesn't make me feel better. It shouldn't, he said. He's testing whether you're a vulnerability. She processed that. And what do we do about it? Nothing. He looked at her now directly. We do nothing. Looking unbothered is the response. She held his gaze. I'm not bothered. I know, he said, and the way he said it was quiet enough that she wasn't sure it was for the room. They stayed another 45 minutes. They shook more hands. They had a brief, deliberate conversation with two of Seoul's most prominent legitimate developers that Zuri carried almost entirely on the strength of her professional knowledge, and she could feel Jitai next to her tracking the room while she talked, his attention divided perfectly between the conversation and everything outside it. In the car on the way home, they were both quiet for a long time. Nam Tae-sik filed a report, Shin said from the front seat, to the CO network. We picked it up 20 minutes ago. What did it say? Jitai asked. That she's real. Shin glanced in the mirror. That she's not what they expected. Jitai said nothing. Zuri looked out the window at Seoul going past and thought about being a calculation in someone else's war. What did they expect? She asked. Shin didn't answer. Jitai said, after a moment, someone easier to use. The fight, the first real one, happened on a Tuesday. 11 days after the forum, the capital injection had cleared and Bennett architecture was operationally alive again, and Zuri had been working 12-hour days in the studio, rebuilding her client pipeline, getting the Incheon concept back into shape for presentation, hiring back the two junior architects who'd been with her before Park destroyed everything. She was on a call with one of them, Lee Soo-yeon, 26, enormously talented, who had been furious on Zuri's behalf through the whole collapse, and who had said yes to coming back before Zuri finished the sentence. When Shin came to the studio door and stood there with the expression that meant something had happened, she ended the call. What? She said. Mr. Kang needs to move your schedule for next Thursday, Shin said. There's a dinner. You're needed. I have a client presentation next Thursday morning that I've been preparing for 2 weeks. The dinner is in the evening. The dinner prep, the briefing, She stopped. What dinner? Representatives from the Hana Investment Group. They're potential investors in a legitimate hospitality development Mr. Kang is pursuing. They want to meet his wife. She looked at Shin. Tell Mr. Kang I'll be available from 7. I need the full day. Shin's expression did a small, careful thing. He was hoping from 4. Then he should have asked me 3 days ago. She went back to her work. 30 minutes later, Jitai came to the studio himself. She heard the wheelchair in the corridor and kept her eyes on her drafting table and breathed through the particular bracing sensation of a confrontation she'd known was coming. Shin relayed your message, he said from the doorway. Good. 4 o'clock is necessary for the preparation timeline. I have a client presentation, she said, turning. A real one. My first since the company restarted. I have been building this for 2 weeks, and I am not cutting the final preparation day short because someone didn't coordinate the calendar correctly. His jaw was set. The Hana dinner is also real. I know it is. 7 o'clock. I'll be ready at 7. That's what I said. The briefing alone. Then send me the briefing documents and I'll read them during lunch on Wednesday. She held his gaze. I am not a prop you can schedule around your operations, Jitai. That was not in the contract. Something flashed across his face. Not anger exactly. Something harder to name. I'm not treating you as a prop. You sent Shin to rearrange my professional day without asking. I had him pass on a request. Framed as a requirement. Silence. He moved further into the room. Not aggressive, but not retreating either. My operations require coordination. So do mine, she said. We have the same amount of stake in this arrangement. The difference is, you seem to have forgotten that. His hands were tight on the armrests. She watched them. The careful, deliberate control of a man whose default response to conflict had always been to lock down, and who was currently encountering someone who was not unlocking for it. 7 o'clock, she said again. Briefing documents by Wednesday noon. That's what I can give you. A long moment. Fine, he said. It wasn't a concession so much as a recognition. She could see that in his face. the acknowledgement of a position he couldn't override and had not fully anticipated. He turned to leave. Jitai. He stopped. The coordination problem isn't going to get better if we don't build a process for it, she said. I'm not trying to make this difficult. I'm trying to make it functional. There's a difference. He was still for a moment, his back to her, the line of his shoulders carrying everything he wasn't saying. I'll have Shin set up a weekly schedule review, he said, without turning. Monday mornings? That works, she said. He left. She turned back to her drafting table and put her hands flat on the surface and breathed. She was not going to think about the way her heart was beating. What? It was Kim who told her 2 days later, sitting in the estate kitchen over tea at 10 in the morning, in the careful way of someone who had decided that a thing needed to be said and was going to say it precisely. He hasn't been wrong to be careful, Kim said, about people. Zuri wrapped both hands around her mug. I know. Before the bombing, he trusted more easily. Kim looked at her tea. There are people in this house who have worked here for 2 years and have never had a conversation with him that lasted more than 5 minutes. Zuri said nothing. She waited. He read your professional portfolio for 3 days before he made the call, Kim said. Not the business side, the actual work, the buildings. A pause. I thought you should know that. Zuri looked at her. Kim stood, picked up her tea, and returned to the business of running the house. Zuri sat there for a long time. She sat there long enough that the tea went cold, and she thought about a man who had read her buildings for 3 days before he decided to call her. And she thought about the second coffee cup that had been on the desk that first morning, and the studio with the good north light, and the way his face had gone undefended for just a moment when he looked at the Incheon drawings. She thought, do not examine this. She thought, you have 11 months left in this contract. She thought, be very, very careful, Zuri. But that night at dinner, they had taken to eating in the same room, not together exactly, but in the same space, each with their own work, a habit that had developed without either of them acknowledging it. She looked up from her laptop and found him looking at her. Not calculating, not assessing, just looking. He looked away immediately. Back to his documents. His face closed like a door. She looked back at her screen. Neither of them said anything. And somewhere in the city below the hill, a meeting was taking place in a private room that neither of them knew about yet. A meeting between 3 men and a woman who moved through Seoul's underworld without leaving visible tracks. A meeting in which Zuri Bennett's name was written on a whiteboard in red, and beneath it, 2 words that meant the same thing in any language: leverage, use her. And the decision that was made in that room was going to reach the estate on the hill within 72 hours. And when it did, nothing about what Zuri and Jitai were carefully, separately, deliberately not feeling was going. The message arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered not through any of Jitai's secure channels, but through Zuri's personal email, her professional address, the one printed on Bennett Architecture's restored business registration, the one she'd had for 6 years and never once considered a vulnerability. It was a single image file. She opened it at her drafting table with her morning coffee still hot beside her and her laptop angled toward the north light, and for 3 full seconds her brain refused to process what she was looking at. Then it did. The photograph was taken from a distance, shot through what was probably a long lens, slightly grainy in the way of surveillance photography rather than amateur work. It showed a woman, Zuri, clearly Zuri, in the dark green dress from the Gangnam Forum, standing in the parking structure beneath the event venue, and beside her, one hand on her arm in a grip that looked from this angle like intimacy rather than what it had actually been, which was Shin redirecting her away from a man who'd been standing too close to the car. Shin's face wasn't visible. What was visible was a man, a different man, not Shin, inserted into the frame with the clean, undetectable seam of someone who knew what they were doing. A man whose face she recognized with a cold, dropping certainty in her chest. Park Sung-hoon, her former partner. The man who had destroyed her company. The man who was, according to Jitae's vague and deliberate non-explanation 3 weeks ago, currently having his legal affairs examined closely by people Zuri hadn't asked about. The caption beneath the image was 4 words in Korean. She translated them without effort. Ask your husband why. She sat completely still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she closed the laptop, picked up her coffee, realized her hand wasn't entirely steady, set the coffee back down. She thought about what the photograph was designed to do. It was designed to make her believe that Ji-tae had a connection to Park Sung-hoon that predated her arrival. It was designed to make her ask Ji-tae about it in a way that would either reveal what she knew to his enemies through the asking, or destroy the fragile operational trust between them if he denied it. It was elegant and ugly in equal measure. She thought about the meeting she didn't know about, the whiteboard with her name in red. Leverage. Use her. She had been waiting for 72 hours for whatever this was to arrive, and now it had arrived and she needed to decide, right now, in the next 3 minutes, whether to take it to Ji-tae or to sit on it and find out what she could first. She opened the laptop. She forwarded the email to Ji-tae's secure address with no message attached. Then she picked up her coffee, went to the window, and waited. Shut. He came in 12 minutes. Not Shin. Ji-tae himself, which told her the message had been flagged immediately, and that whatever it had done to him, it had done it fast enough that he hadn't stopped to send someone else. He came into the studio and closed the door behind him, and she turned from the window and looked at his face, and what she found there was not what she'd been braced for. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't the specific quality of a man caught in something he'd been hiding. It was something rawer than that. Fury, tightly controlled, and beneath the fury something that looked almost like fear. "You saw it," she said. "When did it arrive?" 20 minutes ago. "Who sent it?" "I don't know yet." He moved to her laptop, looked at the image again on the screen with his jaw set so hard the scar on his cheek went white at the edges. "The photograph is fabricated. That is not Park Sung-hoon in the frame." "I know," she said. He looked up. "The angle is wrong," she said. "Whoever they replace Shin with is 2 inches shorter than Park. The shadow doesn't match." She held his gaze. "I spent 6 years in this city reading architectural plans for structural inconsistencies. I know what a bad composite looks like." Something moved through his face. The same recalibration she'd seen before, but deeper this time. "You knew it was fabricated before you sent it to me," he said. "Yes?" "Then why?" "Because you needed to know they sent it," she said. "And because I needed to see your face when you saw it." The room was very quiet. Outside, the estate grounds were gray and still, the city invisible below low cloud. "And," he said carefully, "what does my face tell you?" "That you didn't know it was coming," she said, "and that whoever sent it knows something real, something about Park Sung-hoon and your organization, that they're trying to either reveal or distort." She paused. "What's the real connection?" His hands went still on the armrests. "Ji-tae. Park Sung-hoon has been a peripheral business contact of the CO network for approximately 2 years," he said. His voice had the quality of information being released under pressure, so reluctant, precise. "When my team began examining his affairs, that connection became visible. I did not know about it when I contacted you." She stared at him. The specific cold weight of what he'd just said was settling into her chest in layers. "Park was connected to the people who are trying to destroy you. Peripherally, possibly without full knowledge of the network he was adjacent to. Or with full knowledge." "Yes," he said. "Or with full knowledge." She turned away from him. She walked to the drafting table and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at the Incheon drawings and thought about Park Sung-hoon's smile in that last meeting and the lawsuits and the men in her lobby and the way her company had been disassembled with a precision that had, at the time, felt almost too clean to be just personal malice. "He was used," she said, "to get to me, or to position me, as a potential—" "We don't know that." "Don't." She turned back. "Don't manage what I'm allowed to conclude. Was my company destroyed as a means of making me vulnerable enough to come to you?" The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. "I don't know," Ji-tae said, and she believed him, which was its own kind of terrible. That level of coordination, engineering your vulnerability to create a pretext for our contact, would require foreknowledge of my response to your situation that I find difficult to automatically. But it's possible. Another silence. "It's possible," he said. She looked at him. She looked at the scar, and the controlled fury, and the wheelchair, and the 3 years of sustained assault on his position, and she thought, everything I thought I was running from, I ran directly into. She thought, Park Sung-hoon didn't just take her company. He may have been the instrument that delivered her to this house, to this contract, to a war that had been going on for 3 years before she ever set foot in it. She thought, I am so tired. There's more, Jitae said. She looked at him. Shin briefed me 20 minutes ago. The image was sent to 4 other addresses simultaneously. He paused. Your mother's email address, your former university department head in Atlanta, the Seoul City Architectural Licensing Board, and the managing editor of Korea Architecture Monthly. The bottom of Zuri's stomach dropped out. They're going after my professional reputation, she said. The accompanying message to those addresses was different from yours. It implies an improper relationship between you and Park Sung-hoon during the period of your partnership. Business fraud, personal misconduct. The fabricated image is framed as evidence. There was nothing... I know. There was nothing between me and Park Sung-hoon except... She stopped. She pressed her lips together. My mother. My team is already contacting those addresses with a counterstatement and documentation. His voice was level but careful, the way of someone moving through a room where the floor was uncertain. Your mother will receive a call from my Seoul-based attorney within the hour, explaining the situation fully. A stranger is going to call my mother in Charlotte and explain that her daughter is in the middle of a Korean organized crime war. A lawyer is going to call her and explain that her daughter is the target of a defamation campaign and that we are addressing it legally. She's going to... Zuri stopped. She looked at the ceiling. She breathed. She's going to lose her mind. Yes, he said, without pretending otherwise. Probably. She laughed. It came out short and not entirely sane. She pressed her fingers against her eyes and stood there for a moment in the gray light and tried to find the bottom of this situation, the place where the falling stopped. Why your mother's address? He said. It wasn't a rhetorical question. She dropped her hands. To hurt me, she said. To make me scared enough to make a mistake. Or to make you think I'm a liability. She looked at him. Is that what you think? No, he said, immediately, with no qualification. She held his gaze. Your enemies are very good. Yes, he said. They are. Who is it? Specifically, the 4th organization, the one that's been at this for 3 years. She held up a hand before he could speak. I know you've been vague about this deliberately. I am telling you that vagueness is no longer an option, not after this morning. Jitae looked at her for a long moment, the look of a man who had maintained a boundary for a long time and was now confronting the cost of it. Her name is Yoon Chae-rin, he said. Zuri waited. She was my father's second in command. When my father died, I inherited the organization. She expected to. His voice carried no emotion. It was the voice of someone who had processed this so many times it had become structural rather than felt. The bombing 3 years ago was her work. The wheelchair is her work. The 3 years since have been her work. She knows you. She helped raise me, he said, until I was 12. Then my father sent me away for my education. When I came back, she was... He stopped. She knew me as a child. She does not know me as I am now. She thinks the wheelchair means what it would have meant if she'd been in it. That it broke you. Yes. Zuri was quiet for a moment. It didn't. No. Something in his face. Not quite open, but the door less completely shut than usual. No, it didn't. And the image this morning, sending it to my mother, that's Yoon Chae-rin. That is exactly Yoon Chae-rin. She is precise and she is personal. She finds what matters to people and she goes for it directly. He looked at Zuri steadily. She's been watching you since the press release. She sent the leak. Her assets sent it. Yes. So she has a map of what matters to me, Zuri said. My mother, my professional reputation, my company. She paused. And you. The word landed in the room and sat there. Neither of them addressed it. What happens next? Zuri said. There's a summit, Jitae said, in Busan, 3 weeks from now. The major organizations meet twice yearly to establish operational boundaries and address conflicts. I was going to attend regardless. After this morning, the agenda changes. How? I have to bring evidence of Yoon Chae-rin's 3-year campaign to the other organizations and force a formal position. Either they stand with her or they don't. If they don't, she loses the network support that makes her dangerous. If they do, then we have a different problem. Zuri thought about that, about Busan, and a room full of people who operated in the spaces between laws, and Jitai navigating that room alone. And while you're in Busan, you'll be here, with the full security detail and no. She said it before she'd entirely decided to say it. I'm not sitting in this house waiting to find out what she does while you're gone. Zuri, she already has a map of what matters to me, she said. If you're in Busan and I'm here alone, I am the most accessible point on that map. You know that. His jaw was tight. The estate is the most defensible location. I didn't say I wanted to leave the estate. I said, I'm not sitting here waiting. She held his gaze. Give me something to do. Give me a role in this. I am not a piece you move around the board. I am... She stopped. She thought about what she was. She thought about the contract which said she was a partner in arrangement. She thought about the coffee cup on the desk the first morning, and the studio with the north light, and the man who had read her buildings for 3 days before he called her. She thought about 11 months left on a contract and a woman in Seoul with a whiteboard and a red marker, and the specific targeted cruelty of sending a fabricated image to a woman's mother in Charlotte. I am someone who has already paid a price for being in this, she said. That gives me standing. I'm asking you to acknowledge that. The room was very still. Jitai looked at her for a long time, long enough that she felt the weight of it like something physical. There's a charity gala, he said finally, in 2 weeks, before the Busan Summit, attended by representatives from every major organization in Seoul, legitimate business, government, press. It was always going to be a public positioning event. He paused. Yoon Chae-rin will be there. Zuri felt something cold and clear settle over her. You want me there? I want you there if you choose to be, he said. I won't ask it of you. You just told me Yoon Chae-rin has been watching me for weeks. You told me she is precise and personal and goes directly for what matters. And you're asking if I choose to walk into a room with her. Yes. That's a very honest question. I've found dishonesty to be structurally inefficient, he said. She almost laughed again. This time it was real enough to be felt. I'll be there, she said. He nodded. He started to turn, and she said his name again, and he stopped, and she looked at him with the gray light between them and the city hidden below the cloud and the image still open on her laptop, the fabricated, ugly, precisely targeted image, and said the thing she'd been sitting on since Kim told her about the 3 days he'd spent reading her buildings. When this is over, she said, I want to redesign this house. He went very still. Not tear it down, she said. It's good bones. Whoever built it knew what they were doing, but it's cold in the wrong ways, and nobody's ever made it feel like anyone actually lives here. She met his gaze. I want to fix that. After Busan. After all of it. I want to make it feel like a home. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. She watched something cross his face that she couldn't name, something that didn't have a word in English or Korean, something that was made of equal parts loss and arrival, and the specific terrifying recognition of a thing you have wanted. He didn't answer her. Not that night. She'd said the thing about the house, about the cold and the bones, and making it feel like someone lived there. And something had crossed his face that she couldn't name, and then he'd looked at her for 3 seconds that felt like considerably longer, and then he'd said quietly, "Get some sleep," and left. She stood in the studio in the gray light and listened to the sound of his wheelchair in the corridor until she couldn't hear it anymore. She didn't sleep much. The 2 weeks before the gala moved the way time moved before something terrible. Too fast in the days and too slow in the hours. Each morning arriving before she was ready, and each night stretching into the kind of dark that made the mind run things it shouldn't run. Shin briefed her 3 times. The gala was at the Hanam Grand, a venue that occupied 2 floors of one of Seoul's most deliberately impressive hotels, the kind of place where the architecture was designed to remind you of your smallness. The guest list was 600 people. Of those 600, Shin estimated roughly 40 with direct operational connections to one or more of the 4 organizations. Another 60 with financial ties. The rest were legitimate: politicians, executives, celebrities, journalists. Human scenery in a room where the real conversations happened in margins and hallways and the careful geometry of who stood near whom. Yoon Chae-rin would arrive at 9. She always arrived at 9. She'd been attending this gala for 11 years and she never varied. Zuri wrote that down. She also wrote down everything else Shin told her about Yoon Chae-rin, building a picture the way she built a structural analysis, methodically, looking for load points, looking for the places where the weight was actually carried. 53 years old, raised in Busan, educated in Tokyo, moved through Seoul's underworld with the absolute assurance of someone who'd been operating in it since before many of its current players were born. Elegant, controlled, the kind of dangerous that presented as composed until it didn't. Precisely, Jitae had said, personal. She went directly for what matters. Zuri looked at her notes and thought, then we have something in common. Pesk. The night of the gala, Jitae came to her door. She was dressed and ready. Black this time. A dress that was architectural in its own way, precise and unadorned, nothing that could be read as trying. She'd done her own makeup with the deliberateness of someone preparing for a professional presentation, and she'd put her mother's earrings in again and stood in the mirror and said to herself, "You know what this room is. You've been in hard rooms before." When she opened the door, Jitae was in the corridor in a black suit with a white shirt and no tie, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at her at the Gangnam Forum, that arrested moment before he controlled it. And this time he didn't look away as quickly. "You look ready," she said. "I know. Let's go." The corner of his mouth. Almost. In the car, he handed her a phone she didn't recognize. "Secure line," he said. "Shin's number is the only contact. If I'm not accessible and something happens, you call Shin. Not me. Shin." "Why not you?" "Because if something is happening to you, it means something is also happening to me, and Shin will be the one with the ability to respond." He held her gaze. "Don't argue with me about this." She took the phone. "I'm not arguing." "You were about to." "I was about to ask a clarifying question. There's a difference." She put the phone in her clutch. "What are we walking into?" Jitae looked at his hands for a moment. That deliberate stillness, that control. Yoon Chae-rin will have allies in the room. Not all of them will be known to us. The purpose of tonight, from her perspective, is to read our position before Busan. She'll want to know if we're fractured, if the campaign against you created distance. So we can't be fractured. We can't appear fractured. He looked at her. There's a distinction. Are we fractured? The car moved through Seoul's lit-up dark, the hotel's tower visible ahead, glowing. "No," he said. Not his performance, just a statement. She looked at him. "Good," she said, just as simply. The room knew who he was again, and this time it knew who she was too. 600 people, and she felt the shift when they entered. The recalibration, the current of attention. But it was different from the Gangnam Forum. Bigger, more loaded. The Forum had been professional territory. This was something older and less polite. She kept her shoulder near his and her spine straight, and her face arranged in the expression of a woman who was exactly where she intended to be. They worked the room. She'd been briefed on the names, and she used them, in Korean, with the confidence of someone who'd spent 6 years building fluency for exactly this kind of moment. She watched Jitae operate, the slight modulations of his manner for different conversations, the way he gathered information from pleasantries without appearing to, the way every person he spoke to left the interaction having said more than they'd planned. An hour in, she felt it. Not a sound, not a movement. A quality of attention in the room that changed, like a pressure front shifting. She looked toward the main entrance. Yoon Chae-rin walked in at 9 o'clock exactly. She was not what Zuri had constructed in her mind, which had been building toward something overtly threatening. Instead, a small woman in her 50s in a gray dress, silver hair cut severe and close, a face that was composed with the absolute serenity of someone who had not been surprised by anything in a long time. She moved through the room with the unhurried ease of total ownership. Her eyes found Jitae immediately. And then, a half-second later, they found Zuri. Zuri held the gaze. Yoon Chae-rin's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. A small, recalibrating attention, the look of someone encountering a variable that is slightly different from the model. Good, Zuri thought. Let her recalibrate. She felt Jitai's hand, just the back of it, brushing hers, a contact so brief it might have been accidental. It wasn't accidental. She felt the whole length of that barely there touch move through her arm, and she didn't react and neither did he, but she knew he'd felt it too. Not performance. Something else. She filed it under "Do not examine this" and turned to the man on her left, who was saying something about waterfront development, and answered him in detail and at length, and did not look in Yoon Chae-rin's direction for the next 20 minutes. Seo Min-gyu found her at the bar. She'd been briefed on him, 31, the arrogant only son of Seo Won-soo, the head of the Seo organization. He had his father's connections and none of his father's patience. He had been in the periphery of her awareness all evening. She'd clocked him 30 minutes in, the way Shin had trained her to clock rooms, noting his position and his company and the direction of his attention. His attention had been on her for most of the night. He came to stand beside her at the bar with the confidence of a man who had never once in his life been told to go away and believed that to be a structural feature of the universe. He was good-looking in an overfinished way, the kind of face that had always been told it was. "Bennett Zurisi," he said in Korean. "Or is it Kong Zuri now?" She looked at him. "It's Bennett," she said, "as it has always been." He smiled. "Western custom. I like it." He looked her over in the specific way of a man who wanted her to know he was doing it. "I have to say, I didn't expect you to still be here. I live here. I mean at the gala." His smile stayed pleasant and easy, and his eyes stayed doing something else entirely. "After the photographs last week, I thought perhaps the arrangement might have become complicated." She picked up her drink. Arrangements between adults are rarely as complicated as people who aren't involved in them imagine. "You're very composed." "I'm very bored by this conversation," she said, which is the same thing from the outside. His smile didn't move, but his eyes got sharper. He stepped a fraction closer, not touching, but making the spatial claim of a man who was used to making spatial claims. "He's using you," he said, quieter now. "Whatever he told you the arrangement was, it's not what it is. You're a position piece in a game that started before you got here." "That's interesting," she said. "Are you warning me, or are you making a pitch? Can I be doing both?" "You can do anything you like," she said. "You're doing neither effectively." She stepped back, creating the space he'd removed, and looked at him directly. "Tell your father I said hello." She started to move away. His hand came down on her arm. Not hard, but definite. A grip. The specific, casual ownership of a man expressing that he wasn't done. She went completely still. The bar was loud. The room was loud. 3 feet away, a conversation about real estate was happening between two men in identical dark suits. Across the room, she couldn't see Jitae's position. She couldn't see Shin. She looked down at Seo Min-gyu's hand on her arm. She looked up at his face. "Take your hand off me," she said. Quietly. Clearly. The voice of someone who was not afraid and was not performing not being afraid. He didn't. "I'm trying to help you," he said. "After Busan, the situation around Kang Ji-tae is going to change significantly. You want to be positioned correctly when it does." "You're telling me about Busan," she said. "That's interesting. That's very interesting." She looked at his hand again. "If you're not going to remove that, I'm going to do it for you, and then I'm going to walk directly across this room and repeat this conversation word for word to my husband. You can calculate what happens after that yourself." A beat. He let go. She walked away without hurrying. She moved through the crowd with her heartbeat in her ears, loud and steady, and found Jitae near the east end of the room in a cluster of 3 other men. She came to stand beside him, and he looked at her face, and the conversation he was in stopped. "Excuse me," he said to the other men, in a tone that didn't invite argument, and turned to her. "Seo Min-gyu told me that after Busan, the situation around you is going to change significantly," she said, quietly and directly. He knew to reference Busan. He knows something about what's planned. Jitae's face went absolutely still. "He had his hand on your arm," he said. "He doesn't anymore." She held his gaze. "He knows about Busan, Jitae." Something moved through his eyes, cold and rapid and deeply dangerous. He looked across the room toward the bar and then back to her face. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." The Busan information. I heard you. His voice was low and controlled, and underneath the control was something she'd never heard from him before, something that ran too hot for the armor he usually kept in place. He looked at her for one more second, just her face, just checking, and then pulled out his phone. Shin appeared from somewhere in the crowd 40 seconds later. She stood next to Jitae while he spoke to Shin in rapid, quiet Korean that she caught most of and didn't interrupt, and she was aware of his left hand on the armrest of his wheelchair and the way his knuckles had gone white. She was aware of that, and she was aware of her own heartbeat, and she was aware in the specific way you became aware of things that were already true but that you hadn't finished admitting, that none of what she was feeling right now was contractual. They found her 20 minutes later. Not Seo Min-gyu, not Yoon Chae-rin. A woman Zuri didn't recognize, 30s, pleasant-faced, who came to stand beside her while Ji-tae was occupied 20 feet away in an exchange with two of Seoul's most prominent legitimate businessmen. An exchange that Zuri now understood was also not entirely about business. The woman leaned close, as if sharing something social. Yoon Chae-rin would like a word, she said. In English, accented, precise. Privately. The terrace on the north end, 2 minutes. Zuri looked at her. And if I say no? The woman's pleasant expression didn't shift. Then the documents she has, regarding your mother's financial accounts in Charlotte and the source of those funds over the past 18 months, go to 2 journalists who are in this room tonight. A pause. 2 minutes. She moved away into the crowd. Zuri stood completely still. Her mother's financial accounts. The source of the funds. She thought about the last 18 months. The capital she'd been burning through trying to keep Bennett architecture alive. The loans she hadn't told her mother the full scope of. The time her mother had quietly, without being asked, transferred $12,000 from her retirement savings because she'd heard something in her daughter's voice on the phone and couldn't stand to not do something. $12,000. Her mother's retirement savings. If someone could frame that transfer as something other than what it was, as laundering, as payment, as any of the things it wasn't. If those documents went to journalists in this room tonight, she looked at Jitae's back, 20 feet away. 2 conversations going on simultaneously with people who were all, in their different ways, part of the same structural problem. She had 2 minutes. She thought about telling him. She thought about the secure phone in her clutch with Shin's number on it. She thought about the terrace and Yoon Chae-rin and being precise and personal and going directly for what matters. She thought about her mother in Charlotte, who had sent $12,000 from her retirement savings because she'd heard something in her daughter's voice. She walked toward the north terrace. The terrace was cold and empty except for Yoon Chae-rin. She stood at the railing with a glass of water, not wine, water, and looked out at the Han River and the Seoul night. And when Zuri came through the door, she turned with the unhurried ease of someone who had expected exactly this. Up close, she was both smaller and more formidable than the distance had suggested. Her face had the quality of fine-grained stone, not hard in the way of someone who'd made themselves hard, but simply dense, composed of something that had never been soft to begin with. She looked at Zuri the way you looked at something you'd been studying for weeks from a distance and were now finally examining in person. "You came," she said. Her English was excellent and almost accentless. "You made a reasonable argument," Zuri said. Yoon Chae-rin almost smiled. "I've been watching you since the press release. I wanted to understand what kind of woman would enter this arrangement voluntarily. And what kind am I?" "Smarter than the arrangement," Yoon Chae-rin said, "which makes you interesting and more dangerous than he realizes." She tilted her head. "He hasn't told you everything?" "He's told me enough." "He hasn't told you about Jang Il-ho?" Zuri kept her face still. "No," she said. "He hasn't." Jang Il-ho was Jitae's closest advisor for 11 years. He survived the bombing. He was part of the investigation team after. She picked up her glass, considered it. "He's been my source inside the Kang organization for 27 months. The cold came off the river and hit the terrace, and Zuri felt it move through her dress. Jang Il-ho, who is still in Jitae's organization. "Who is currently in Busan," Yoon Chae-rin said, "preparing the location for the summit, who has been sending me every detail of Jitae's Busan strategy for the last 3 weeks. Zuri thought about Jitae in a conference room with Jang Il-ho. She thought about Jitae trusting the wrong person, She thought about how thoroughly she understood that specific experience. "What do you want?" she said. "Leave," Yoon Chae-rin said, simply. "Take the contract dissolution clause. Take the capital. Walk away from this and go back to your buildings. I have no interest in you. My interest is Ji-tae, and if you're no longer in the picture, there's no reason for your mother's finances or your professional reputation to become anyone's concern. You want me to abandon him before Busan. I want you to survive," Yoon Chae-rin said, "which you won't do if you're standing next to him when this collapses." Zuri looked at her. She looked at the composed, dense face of a woman who had spent 3 years engineering the destruction of a man from the inside. And she thought about the whiteboard with the red marker and the fabricated photograph and the targeted cruelty of it. Not just cruelty, she understood now, standing here, but intelligence. Real intelligence. The kind that understood exactly which levers moved which people. "You know what I find interesting," Zuri said. Yoon Chae-rin waited. "You came here tonight. To this terrace. To talk to me personally." Zuri held her gaze. "You could have had that woman deliver a message. You could have sent another email. You didn't. You came yourself." She paused. "You're not certain it's going to work. The Busan plan. You're not certain Jong Il-ho is going to be enough. And you think I'm the variable you haven't fully calculated." Something in Yoon Chae-rin's face. Quick and immediately controlled. There it was. "You have 24 hours to decide," Yoon Chae-rin said. Her voice had lost 1 degree of its composure, barely perceptible, but there. "After that, the documents go out regardless." "Understood," Zuri said. She turned and walked back through the terrace door. She found Ji-tae in the corridor outside the main hall, Shin beside him, both of them with the look of men who had been trying to locate something and had just found it. "Where were you?" Ji-tae said. She looked at him. The scar. The controlled fury that was already building because he'd noticed she was gone. The knuckles tight on the armrests again. The man who had read her buildings for 3 days before he called her and had put the Good North Light in a studio and had never once treated her like something disposable. "Jang Il-ho," she said. The blood left Ji-tae's face. Not all of it, not dramatically. Just enough, just a fraction of the color going out of his jaw and his eyes doing something she'd never seen them do. Something that was the opposite of the controlled and the armored. Something raw and struck and terrible. He knew what she was going to say before she said it. "He's been feeding Yoon Chae-rin your Busan strategy," she said. "For 27 months, she told me herself." The corridor was empty except for the 3 of them. Somewhere behind the main hall doors, 600 people went on doing what they were doing, not knowing that in this hallway, a man who had held his empire together through 3 years of sustained assault from someone who had helped raise him was now learning that the last person he'd trusted completely had... The drive back from the gala was the quietest 40 minutes Zuri had ever spent in a moving vehicle. Ji-tae said nothing. Not a word from the moment they reached the car. Not through the city, not through the hills, not through the gates. He sat with his hands in his lap, not on the armrests, not in the controlled, deliberate position she'd learned to read as management, just in his lap, still, like a man who had put down something heavy and didn't know yet what to pick up instead. Shin drove. His eyes stayed on the road. Zuri sat beside Ji-tae in the back and watched Seoul drop away below them and thought about Jang Il-ho, who was in Busan right now, in a hotel room or a conference space, preparing a location for a summit that he had already betrayed. 27 months. She kept returning to that number. 27 months of sitting across tables from Ji-tae, of being trusted with strategy and schedules and the interior architecture of an organization's plans, and feeding it outward, piece by piece, to the woman who had built the bomb that put Ji-tae in that wheelchair. She thought about what that kind of betrayal did to a person's ability to trust anything again. She thought about the way the color had gone out of Ji-tae's face in that corridor, the raw and terrible thing she'd seen in his eyes for the 3 seconds before he controlled it. She didn't say anything. Not in the car. Some things needed to be arrived at rather than approached. Inside the estate, Ji-tae went directly to the study. He didn't close the door, which she understood as the thing it was. Not an invitation, but not a closing off either. A door left open by a man who was operating below his usual level of deliberateness. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen, found the kettle, made tea, the strong Korean barley tea that Kim kept in the second cabinet, that she'd started drinking 3 weeks ago because the smell of it had begun to mean the estate to her in the specific sensory way that places got into you, and carried 2 cups to the study. Jitai was at his desk, not working, sitting in front of documents he wasn't reading, his hands flat on the surface, staring at something that wasn't in the room. She set 1 cup beside his hands. She sat in the chair across the desk. She waited. He looked at the tea. He didn't pick it up. 11 years, he said. His voice was even, but it was the evenness of tremendous effort. Jang Il-ho has been with this organization for 11 years. He was with my father before me. A pause. I appointed him to the transition team after the bombing. I trusted him with the restructuring. I know, she said. After the bombing, when I couldn't... He stopped. His jaw worked. There were months when I couldn't operate at full capacity. He was the person who held certain functions together. I trusted him with... He stopped again. With things that would have ended us if they had gone to the wrong hands. And did they? He looked at her. The question was honest, and he answered it honestly. Some, not all. Which means Yoon Chae-rin chose carefully what she used and what she held back. She was building toward Busan. She was letting enough stay stable that I wouldn't discover the leak before she was ready to use everything at once. She's patient, Zuri said. She's been patient for 3 years, he said, since the bombing. Zuri looked at him. She thought about patience as a weapon, about a woman who could wait 3 years for the right configuration of vulnerabilities. About what it took to sustain that kind of focus, that kind of cold, aimed intent. She's going to move the Busan timeline, Zuri said. She knows I told you about Jang Il-ho. She knows her inside information is burned. She won't wait for the summit. No, Jitai said. She won't. How long? 48 hours. Maybe less. He finally picked up the tea. He held it in both hands without drinking it. She'll want to act before I can restructure, before I can replace the intelligence Jang was providing her with silence. Then we have tonight. He looked at her. To prepare, she said. Tonight and tomorrow. Whatever you need to do to go into this without Jang's access being a liability. She held his gaze. Tell me what you need. Zuri, you can tell me it's not my problem, she said. You can tell me the contract doesn't cover this. You can remind me that I'm an architect from Charlotte who signed an 18-month arrangement and that none of what happened tonight was in the terms. She set her cup down. Or you can tell me what you need. He looked at her for a long time. I need to make 3 calls tonight, he said finally. People I trust outside the organization. After that, I need to brief Shin on a revised Busan protocol. After that, he stopped. After that, I don't know. Make the calls, she said. I'll be here. She was. She sat in the study while he worked, not in his way, but present in the room, at the chair beside the window with the ancient drawings she'd brought from the studio. Not because she was going to work on them, but because having something in her hands kept her from performing calm rather than having it. She listened to the cadence of his phone calls without processing the words, the low-controlled voice moving through Korean and occasionally English, and she thought about Yoon Chae-rin on the terrace with her glass of water and her perfect composure and her 24-hour deadline. Leave, she had said. Take the contract dissolution. Walk away. Zuri thought about what it would have looked like if she had. If she'd come off that terrace and gone to Shin and said, take me home, and packed her 2 suitcases and her 4 boxes and taken the contractual exit in the capital and gone back to Atlanta and rebuilt there, far from this city and this estate and this man and this war that had been running for 3 years before she ever arrived. She thought about it with genuine honesty. She gave it real consideration, which she thought was important, not dismissing it the way you dismiss the options you'd already decided against, but actually examining it, what that life looked like, whether it would have been the right thing. Then she looked at Jitae on the phone at his desk, his voice low and controlled, his hand flat on the surface next to the tea she'd made, and she knew with the specific clarity of things you stopped arguing with yourself about that she had not been going to leave. Not because of the contract, not because of the money or the company, or any of the original transactional terms, because she was, At some point in the last 6 weeks that she could not identify precisely, no longer capable of treating his survival as something separate from her own. She did not examine this. She looked at her drawings, and she waited. Well, Jang Il-ho was brought to the estate at 2 in the morning. She didn't see it happen. She was in the study when she heard vehicles on the gravel and then voices in the corridor. Controlled, quiet, the specific acoustic signature of people managing a situation. And then the house absorbed it and went quiet again, and an hour later Shin appeared in the study doorway. "Secured," he said to Jitai. Jitai nodded. His face had closed down into the complete professional blankness of someone operating in executive mode. "The 3 network contacts are activated. The Busan protocol is revised." He looked at Shin. "Tomorrow morning, we move." Shin nodded and withdrew. Jitai sat still for a moment after he left. "Are you going to Busan?" Zuri said. "Yes." "Alone?" "With Shin and 4 others." He looked at her. "You're staying here." "I know. I need you to know that the estate security is Jitai." She said his name quietly. "I trust you to have done what you can. I'm not going to spend the next 2 days making it harder by arguing about it." He looked at her with the expression she'd started cataloging privately as the recalibration look, the one that happened when she said or did something that shifted his calculations. He'd had it the first night she read the contract. He'd had it when she sent him the email instead of sitting on it. He'd had it when she told him about the Incheon drawings and the east-facing cantilever. He had it now. "Get some sleep," she said. "You have a long day tomorrow." She picked up her drawings and went to the door. "Zuri." She stopped. "What she offered you," he said. "On the terrace. The dissolution clause, the capital, the exit." He paused, and the pause had weight. "I wouldn't have blamed you." She turned. She looked at him in the lamplight, at the scar and the stillness and the desk covered in documents that represented the full, complicated weight of a life he had not chosen to make simple. "I know you wouldn't have," she said. "That's not why I'm still here." She left before he could answer. He left for Busan at 6 in the morning. She stood in the entrance hall in her pajamas with her arms crossed and watched Shin and the others load into 3 vehicles and watched Jitai stop at the estate doors and turn and look at her. He didn't say goodbye. He wasn't a man who said goodbye. He looked at her the way you looked at something you were memorizing. She held his gaze and gave him a single small nod. "Go, I'll be here. Come back." He held it for 1 more second. Then he went. Bulky. The next 48 hours were the longest of her life, and she had recently had some very long hours to compare them against. She worked. She went to the studio, and she put the Incheon cantilever back where it belonged, and she drafted the structural calculations she'd compromised 2 years ago, and she worked with the focused intensity of someone who needed their hands busy and their mind occupied with something that had weight and logic and the possibility of being done correctly. She called her mother. That conversation was 40 minutes long and covered in sequence. Relief that Zuri was physically safe, bewilderment at the full scope of the situation, a very long silence followed by her mother saying in the particular tone of a woman who had raised her daughter to read rooms and situations carefully, "Do you love him?" Zuri looked at the Incheon drawings. "Mom." "That's a yes," her mother said. "Okay. Is he good to you?" "Yes," Zuri said, immediately, without qualification. "Okay, her mother said again. "Then you call me when it's over." She called Lee Soo-yeon and told her Bennett Architecture was on temporary hold for 1 week, and that everything was fine, which was partly true. Soo-yeon, who was 26 and enormously talented and had very good instincts, said, "Okay," in a tone that conveyed she knew everything was not fine and was choosing to trust Zuri anyway. On the second day, Kim brought tea to the studio and sat across from her and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. On the second night, Shin called. "It's done," he said. "We're coming home. Utam." Jitae came back on the 3rd morning. He looked like a man who had not slept. The suit from Busan had been exchanged for a dark shirt, and he moved with the controlled exhaustion of someone operating on the far side of their reserves. And when his car came through the estate gates and she saw him through the entrance hall window, she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was wound that tight. She was in the entrance hall when he came in. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the doorway that morning. The memorizing look, but different now, coming from the other direction. "Tell me," she said. He told her. The Busan summit had not gone as Yoon Chae-rin had planned, because Jang Il-ho confronted at 2 in the morning with the full scope of what he had provided and to whom and for how long, had made a choice. Not a noble one. Ji-tae was precise about this. There was nothing noble about it. It was the choice of a man who had looked at his options and calculated the least damaging one, but a useful one. He had provided a full accounting. Every piece of information he had passed to Yoon Chae-rin over 27 months, every instruction he had received, including details of the Busan plan that Yoon Chae-rin didn't know he had, details that gave Ji-tae what he needed to walk into the summit with documentation rather than claims. He'd laid it out in front of representatives of all 4 organizations, including Yoon Chae-rin's own primary ally, and he'd given them a choice between standing with a campaign built on 27 months of fabricated intelligence and manipulated information, or stepping away from it cleanly while there was still a clean way to step. Most of them had stepped away. Yoon Chae-rin had sat in that room and understood what was happening and had not shown it on her face, which Ji-tae described with a strange and complicated respect that Zuri understood. The respect you felt for an opponent who went down with dignity even when the going down was something they'd earned. She had left Busan the same night under an agreement that removed her from operational standing in the Seoul networks entirely. Not incarceration, not violence, removal. Retirement, structured and enforced from a world she'd operated in for 30 years. It was not, Ji-tae said, everything she deserved for the bombing, for 3 years of sustained assault, for the targeted cruelty of photographs sent to mothers in Charlotte. It was what was achievable within the constraints of a world that ran on different rules. "Is it enough?" Zuri asked. He was quiet for a moment. "It's what it is," he said. "It ends the active campaign. What she deserves and what I can deliver in that room are different things." Zuri nodded. She understood the distinction. She'd made peace with versions of it herself, in the context of Park Sung-hoon, who had withdrawn every legal claim against her 2 months ago, and retreated into the specific obscurity of a man who understood that pressing further would cost him things he wasn't willing to lose. It wasn't justice, exactly. It was cessation. Sometimes cessation was what you got. "And Jang Il-ho," she said. "Gone," Ji-tae said. "From the organization. From Seoul." His voice was level. She could hear everything beneath the level that he wasn't letting into his voice. "He's been with me since I was 28 years old." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I don't—" He stopped. He looked at his hands. The scar along his jaw caught the morning light. "I don't know how I missed it." "Because you trusted him," she said. "That's not a flaw. That's what trust is. It's the cost of it." The cost was significant. "Yes," she said. "It was. And you're still here." He looked up at her. "You're still here," she said again quietly, making it land. "Everything she spent 3 years building toward, and you're still here. In this house. That's not nothing." He held her gaze for a long moment. The particular quality of his looking, that recalibration, that slow reassessment, but deeper this time, coming from somewhere below the place where he made decisions and into the place where things simply were. "I need to sleep," he said. "I know. And then I need to talk to you." "I know that too," she said. "Go. I'll be here." He slept for 14 hours. She knew because she was aware of the house around her in the specific way she'd become aware of it. Its sounds, its rhythms, the acoustic signature of each of its occupied spaces. And the East Wing was quiet in the way it was only quiet when he was genuinely at rest rather than working in silence. She used the time. She went to the North Wing studio and she finished the Incheon cantilever calculations. And she began, for the first time, the preliminary sketches for the estate renovation she'd proposed 3 weeks ago in the studio, in the gray light, when she'd said the thing about the cold and the bones and making it feel like someone lived there. She didn't know yet whether she'd still be here to execute it. The contract had 12 months remaining, and its terms were clear, and she had, in the last 3 weeks, stopped being able to calculate clearly what she wanted the end of those 12 months to look like. She drew anyway. She drew the east wing with more light, the main corridor with the particular plant life she'd identified in the estate grounds that could be brought inside without being domesticated. Wild enough to feel alive, specific enough to feel intentional. She drew the main room with different furniture configurations that would make the space feel inhabited rather than observed. She drew for 6 hours, and when she stopped, she looked at what she'd done and thought, this is what I do when I love something. I figure out what it needs and I give it that. She sat with that thought. She didn't run from it. He found her in the kitchen at 9 in the evening. She was making rice the way her mother made it, too much of it, with the kind of distracted generosity that cooked for the people who might appear rather than just the ones who were certain. And she heard the wheelchair in the corridor and didn't turn around. He came in. She felt him stop near the doorway. There's enough, she said. He came to the kitchen table and sat. She brought 2 bowls, the way she'd learned to do without making it a gesture. Just bringing the food, just feeding the people in the room, the way her mother had always fed everyone who walked through her door, regardless of circumstance. They ate. The kitchen was warm and the estate was quiet around them, and outside the November dark had settled over the Seoul hills with the particular completeness of a cold night after a long day. The contract, Jitai said. She set her spoon down. The contract has 11.5 months remaining, he said. He was looking at the table. His voice had the quality of something being said carefully because the words mattered, and he was not a man who used words for anything except their actual purpose. The dissolution clause is available to both parties at any time. The capital and professional assets you've accumulated remain yours regardless. She waited. He looked up. I'm not asking you to stay because of the contract, he said. I want to be precise about that. The contract is irrelevant to what I'm saying. What I'm saying is... He stopped. He looked at her with the expression she didn't have a name for, the one that was loss and arrival in the same moment. I don't know how to do this, he said. I know how to run an organization. I know how to manage threats and structure agreements and hold things together through sustained pressure. I don't know how to... Say what you mean, she said. He held her gaze. I would like you to stay, he said. Not for the 18 months. Not for the appearance of stability or the signaling to rivals or any of the reasons the contract was built around. He paused. Because this house is different when you're in it. Because you walked into a meeting with Yoon Chae-rin alone rather than leave me without information I needed, and you did it without telling me because you knew I would have stopped you. He paused again. Because you made rice. She looked at him. That's not a small list, she said. No, he said. It's not. Ji-tae. When the bombing happened, she stopped, chose. Were you alone? He was quiet for a moment. Functionally, he said. Yes. And the 3 years after? Yes. She thought about that. About 3 years of holding something together while someone you'd once trusted dismantled it piece by piece, and doing it alone, and doing it from a wheelchair, and not breaking. Not letting it break you into something smaller or crueler or more closed than you'd been before. She thought about what that cost. She thought about the second coffee cup on the first morning, and the studio, and the east-facing cantilever, and the way he said her name when she did something that surprised him. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He looked at her. I'm not leaving, she said. Not at 18 months. Not at the end of the contract. I'm telling you that directly because you gave me the dissolution terms, and I want you to understand that I heard them, and I'm making a different choice. She held his gaze. But I need you to understand something in return. Tell me. I'm not a piece in your operational structure, she said. I'm not a signal you send to rivals or a position you hold. What I am to you has to be... She searched for the word. It has to be real. It has to function the way real things function, which means it's hard sometimes and it costs something and neither of us can manage it from behind a desk. His jaw was tight. His hands were still. I understand that. I don't think you fully do yet, she said. Not unkindly, but I think you're willing to learn it, and that's enough. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the warm light with the cold city dark outside and the quiet estate around them, and he said, yes, with the simple, enormous weight of a man who had been careful with words for so long that when he used one to mean everything, it landed that way. Yes, he said again, quietly, like a door opening rather than closing. She picked up her spoon. Eat your rice, she said. Something moved across his face that she had never seen there before. Something that was entirely unguarded, that didn't get controlled or contained, that simply existed for a moment in the kitchen light. He picked up his spoon. They ate. In the weeks that followed, the estate began slowly and without announcement to change, not dramatically, not all at once. Zuri worked on the renovation designs in the studio in the mornings and presented them to Jitai in the evenings with the directness of a professional who knew what she was doing and the particular honesty of a woman who was no longer pretending she wasn't also doing it for herself. He looked at each drawing with the same focused attention he gave everything and approved most of them and pushed back on two, not from the coldness of a man protecting his space, but from the specific resistance of someone learning to have preferences about a place he'd never allowed himself to fully inhabit. The plants came first, the ones she'd sketched, native, wind-shaped, specific, moved from the estate grounds into the main corridor in the east wing and the room with the window that faced the city, and the house began, incrementally, to smell like itself rather than like careful maintenance. Bennett Architecture took on a new commission in January. The Incheon waterfront concept, the real one, with the east-facing cantilever restored to its original calculation, went into formal development with a City Council Architectural Advisory Board that took it seriously for the first time in its existence. Lee Soo-yeon came on full-time. By February, they were 3 people, and by April, they were 6, in a proper office in Mappo that Zuri had designed herself, with the kind of light she knew how to make work. She drove herself there. She had a security presence, would have one for the foreseeable future, which was simply the cost of the life she'd chosen. But she drove, which was the thing that mattered. She called her mother every Sunday. Her mother had opinions about everything, delivered at length and with great affection and very little filtering. And Zuri sat in the studio on Sunday mornings with her coffee and let her mother talk for an hour and felt the specific, uncomplicated grounding of being known by someone who had known you your whole life. Her mother came to Seoul in March. She stood in the estate entrance hall and looked around with the careful, systematic attention that Zuri had inherited from her, and then she looked at Jitai, who was waiting in that controlled, deliberate way he had, composed enough to be formal, not composed enough to be cold, and she said, "You have a good house. It needed the plants." Jitai looked at her. "Yes," he said. "It did." Her mother looked at Zuri with the look that meant she had confirmed something she'd already decided. She said nothing else about it. She stayed for a week, and she ate Kim's cooking, and she walked in the estate grounds in the gray March mornings, and she went home to Charlotte having concluded, in the way she concluded things, thoroughly and without requiring anyone's input, that her daughter was where she was supposed to be. On the day the original contract would have expired, they did not mark it, did not plan anything around it. The date was simply a day. Jitai found the contract in the study drawer where it had been since the night she'd signed it. He brought it to the kitchen table. She was there. Tea, late evening, the city lights moving below the hill through the window she'd opened wider during the renovation, the one that looked south toward the Han. He set it on the table. She looked at it. The 8 pages, printed and signed, the terms she'd read 3 times in a room with a man she hadn't known, and the sole rain coming down. "I want to destroy it," he said. She looked at him. "We could just file it." "No," he said. "I want to destroy it." She considered this. "Okay," she said. He tore it in half, then in half again. Then he kept going, the way people did when they needed the physical action to be more than symbolic, the methodical tearing until the pages were small enough that the words were illegible and the terms were unreadable, and the whole careful structure of what they'd agreed to that November night was simply paper. He pushed the pieces into a pile. She looked at the pile. "We need a second wedding," she said. He looked at her. "The original one was administrative," she said. "Paperwork in a courthouse in Mappo with 2 of Shin's people as witnesses. That's not—" She met his eyes. "That's not what this is now. I want something real, small, just the people who matter, but real." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother needs to be there," she said. "Yes," he said. "And Kim." "Obviously," he said, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it did, the thing that after 8 months she'd stopped waiting for and started simply receiving when it arrived, the not-quite smile that was somehow, each time, still unexpected. And it has to be outside, she said. The South Terrace. In the spring when the grounds are... Zuri. What? I already know, he said quietly. Whatever you're about to describe. I already know I want it. She looked at him in the kitchen light, at the scar and the stillness and the hands that held the destroyed contract pieces. And she thought about Charlotte and Atlanta and a borrowed confidence and 6 years in a city that wasn't hers, that had become hers anyway, and a company she'd built twice now, and a man who had read her buildings for 3 days before he called her, and had put a studio with good north light in the house where she was going to live for a very long time. She thought about all of it, and she let herself have it, not carefully, not behind glass, not at the managed distance of a woman protecting herself from the cost of wanting things. She let herself have it the way you let yourself have the things that were real. Okay, she said. Then we agree. She reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. Warm, deliberate, the way he did everything, with intention, with weight, with the specific quality of a man who understood that this was the most important thing he was doing right now and was not going to do it at less than his full attention. Outside, Seoul burned below the hill, patient and indifferent and enormous, doing what cities did, going on, going forward, full of people building and losing and starting over and finding, in the middle of all that ordinary human combustion, the occasional inexplicable thing that made the rest of it make sense. The estate was warm. The plants moved slightly in the air from the open window. And in the kitchen, over destroyed paper and cold tea, two people who had found each other through a contract neither of them had signed for the right reasons sat together in the light and understood, without needing to say it out loud, that whatever came next was going to be built on something that no document had ever been able to contain. The contract was gone. Everything else was just beginning.